The night the emperor stood up in the middle of the imperial council, silencing 11 men with nothing but the weight of his stillness, nobody understood why he did it for her. A woman with ink-stained hands. No title. No army. Only a bronze ring worn thin by generations, a forged document she had already seen through, and 16 years of a grief she had never once let speak louder than her work. Aldrich Moore had spent 30 years erasing her family from history. He had burned the house, buried the name, signed a death warrant without a trial. And he had almost succeeded, until the imperial seal, carved in black granite since the empire's founding, lit up amber gold at the touch of her hand on a January night. Why did the emperor rise for her, and what did he already know that she didn't? The courtyard was the kind of cold that had forgotten how to apologize for itself. Eloan Dragici walked quickly, her breath disappearing in small clouds ahead of her, each one gone before she could think to watch it go. January and Varith did not negotiate. The stone beneath her boots was slick with a rain that had never quite decided to become snow, and the torches along the inner walls guttered in a wind that came from nowhere and went everywhere at once. She had not intended to come this way. The scribe's year-end gathering had driven her out, 40 minutes of her name being asked, and her origins being asked, and her family being asked, each question delivered with the cheerful obliviousness of people who had never needed to make a story out of silence. She had smiled until she couldn't, set down her wine, and slipped through the side door before anyone noticed she was the kind of person who slipped through side doors. The servants' passage through the outer wing was faster. The inner courtyard was faster still. In 7 years of walking these corridors, she had learned that the quickest routes were almost always the ones no one else bothered to take. She was halfway across the courtyard when she stopped. She did not know why she stopped. The seal was in the center of the gate, carved into a block of black granite that had been there since the empire's founding, older than anyone alive, older than anyone's grandfather. She had walked past it perhaps 1,000 times. An eagle, wings spread, a sword caught in its beak. The stone around it was dark with age and moisture, and on a night like this it looked like nothing so much as a grave marker for something that had never died. Her hand moved before her mind did. The granite was cold. Not the polite cold of winterstone, but something older and more deliberate. The kind of cold that had been waiting. And then light. It came from her palm, amber gold, the color of resin caught in afternoon sun, and it spread from where she touched the stone outward along the carved grooves of the eagle's wings, until the entire seal was burning softly in the January dark. No heat, only warmth, which was different. Warmth the way a hand held near a candle flame is warm, the way something alive is warm. It lasted 2 minutes. She counted, because counting was the only thing her mind could hold on to. When it faded, the courtyard was dark again and very quiet, and Eloan stood with her hand still pressed to cold stone, and did not move for a long time. She was listening to her own breathing. It sounded like someone she hadn't met before. High above her, on the gallery that ran the length of the eastern wall, a figure stood without moving. She did not see him. She was already looking at her own hand. She walked back to her room with the controlled step of someone who had learned, young, that running only confirmed whatever was chasing you. Her room was on the 3rd level of the library wing, small and warm from the hearth she kept burning through all of winter. The walls were lined with whatever manuscripts she was currently working on, not for decoration but for proximity, because she thought better with text visible, with the sense that all the problems she was working on were in the same room with her. Over 7 years, the room had accumulated things she hadn't chosen to accumulate. A pressed fern from the summer she'd spent cataloging the Northern Archive, a small clay bowl she used for ink, and occasionally forgot was not a cup, stacks of reference volumes that had migrated from their proper shelves and simply never returned. The housekeeper the library wing shared, a quiet, broad-shouldered woman named Hildy, had a habit of leaving bread and something warm outside Alohan's door on late nights, setting the clay dish down without knocking, with the gentle certainty of someone who understood that company and care were not always the same thing. Tonight the dish was already there when she returned. She stepped over it and went inside. Alohan sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hand. Nothing remarkable about it. Ink stained at the first knuckle of her right index finger, a small callus from her pen grip, the kind of hand that spent most of its hours doing work that other people never thought to wonder about. She held it in her lap for a while. Then she opened the second drawer of her bedside table and took out the ring. It was bronze, thinned at the band from generations of wearing. Her mother had worn it every day of her life, or so Alohan had been told. She had exactly one memory of her mother that she trusted completely. A hand in lamplight, a ring on the smallest finger turning a page. Everything else had the uncertain texture of things described to her by people who had their own reasons to remember a certain way. The ring had been in the family longer than the memory. She carried it to the hearth and held it in the firelight. The engraving on the face was almost worn smooth. She had studied it so many times it had stopped resolving into anything specific, become simply the faint impression of something, a shape without edges, the ghost of a detail. Now, in the fire's light, she pressed her thumb to the bronze and looked. An eagle. Small, old, the lines wore nearly to nothing. But there, the spread of wings, the sword held in the beak, the same posture as the seal in the courtyard below, scaled down to fit a ring, carrying the same geometry, the same particular angle of the head. She had owned this ring for 16 years. She had looked at it for 16 years. The fire pressed its heat against the bronze, and for the first time in all those years of carrying it, she felt the strange and terrible sensation of being close to something. Not to an answer. She was too careful a scholar to mistake proximity for arrival, but to the beginning of the right question. 3 days later, she was translating a water rights dispute from 1043. The candles had burned down to their last quarter. Outside the reading room, the library was empty. The junior archivists had gone home at vespers, the senior ones shortly after, and now there was only the sound of the building settling in the cold, the occasional pop from the hearth, the scratch of her pen. She preferred this hour. The work was the same as always, but it felt more honest at night, stripped of the performance of industry that the daylight hours required. She was halfway through a particularly tedious clause about irrigation rights, 11 pages of passionate argument about a ditch, which she had privately begun to regard as the most entertaining thing she had translated all year, when she heard the door. Not the main door. That one announced itself with the groan of iron hinges that hadn't been properly oiled since the last emperor's reign. This was the side door, the one that opened quietly for people who knew which way to push it. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was on because she had learned that looking up quickly told people things about you. When she did look up, a man had pulled out the chair across from her and was sitting down. No announcement. No guard. No preceding footstep that had announced itself as anything more than a person who moved quietly through spaces that belonged to him. She recognized him eventually. It took a moment, because she had only ever seen him from a distance. At official functions she attended in her capacity as a record keeper, standing at the back of rooms where everyone else was looking at him. Up close, he was something she had no prepared category for, and she was aware of this absence, and returned her gaze to the manuscript. "The seal last activated at my great-grandfather's coronation," he said. His voice was level, the kind of level that came from practice rather than ease. 214 years ago. I know. She set her pen down carefully. I translated that chronicle. The original vellum was deteriorating, the binding had split, and someone needed to copy it before the pages separated. Who assigned it to you? No one. She met his eyes. I chose it. He said nothing. She could feel him watching her, not the assessing look of someone deciding whether to be concerned, but something more deliberate. Patient. The look of a man who had learned that waiting cost less than speaking. Do you know why it responded to you? He asked. No. She held his gaze, because the question deserved the honesty of eye contact. But I'm trying to find out. She watched him register her answer. He had not expected this. Not fear, not deference, not the kind of eager explanation that people offered when they were afraid of silence. He leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, and his eyes moved to her hands. To the bronze ring on her smallest finger. She reached into the desk drawer and placed the ring on the table between them. The space between the ring and his hands was perhaps 20 centimeters. She became aware of this measurement in a way that seemed disproportionate. An eagle, he said, very quietly. My mother's. She met his eyes. She never explained it. He studied the ring for a long moment without touching it. This close, in the low light of the candles, she could see that his eyes were not quite black. There was gray in them, like iron seen through smoke. And they were very still. The way deep water is still above a current, it doesn't choose to show. He had the kind of face that had been arranged by experience into something that looked, from a distance, like composure. Then he leaned back, and the 20 centimeters became 40 again, and she could breathe in the ordinary way. Don't leave the city, he said. I had no plans to, Your Majesty. Good. He rose. He was taller than she had understood from across rooms. The distance of official functions had flattened him into something two-dimensional, and standing, he reassembled into a person with actual weight. She did not stand. Some instinct she couldn't name held her in her chair, and he didn't seem to expect it, or if he did, he chose not to remark on it. At the door, he stopped. What is your name? She told him. The pause that followed was brief, just long enough to be specific, to carry intention rather than accident. His shoulders did not move, but something in them, the angle of the line from neck to shoulder blade, changed slightly, and did not change back. Then he walked into the dark and was gone, and she sat at her desk, with the untranslated water rights dispute in front of her, and did not pick up her pen for a long time. The irrigation ditch could wait. The knock came at the third watch. She was still awake. She had been awake since the library, moving between the water rights dispute and the ring and the particular cold clarity that descended on her when she was close to something she couldn't yet name. And she opened the door to find a man, of about 70, in a drenched monk's habit, water streaming from the hem, to pool on the stone floor of the corridor. He was shaking, not from cold. I knew, he said. He was looking at her face the way people looked at mirrors, when they were afraid of what they might see there. About your bloodline, I have known for 40 years, since before you were born. Her hand was still on the door. She did not open it wider or close it. You had better come in, she said. His name was Frater Emre. He had served the Imperial Library's monastic annex for 5 decades, which meant he had outlasted 4 librarians and 2 emperors and more administrative upheavals than he could number. He sat in her one good chair and turned his hat in his hands and told her everything with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been waiting for this particular conversation for a very long time, who had rehearsed it so many times that the words came out worn smooth, like stone steps shaped by feet that never stopped passing over them. 40 years ago, cataloging the oldest section of the monastic archive, he had found a genealogy. Not any genealogy. The genealogy, handwritten in the founding empress's own hand, the document that traced every branch of the imperial bloodline, including the branches that had been quietly and deliberately separated from the main trunk over the centuries. The Dragici family appeared on the third page, a cadet line of the founding empress, carrying the same blood that had built the seal. Not close enough to threaten succession in ordinary times, but close enough to matter, close enough that someone had decided, at some point, that their existence was inconvenient. He had brought it to the attention of the man who was then newly appointed as imperial chancellor. Aldrich Moore had thanked him pleasantly and told him in a voice that was equally pleasant to forget what he had found. He was very polite about it, Emmerich said. He was still turning the hat, the brim making slow circles in his hands. That was the frightening part. He didn't threaten me. He simply explained, in very clear terms, what would happen. To the annex's funding, to my position, to several colleagues I valued, if I persisted in remembering. And then 16 years ago, Elowen said. Your father. The old man stopped turning the hat. Henrik Dragici found it himself. The same archive, a different route in. He was a scholar. He understood what he was looking at immediately. He paused. The pause had the shape of something he had been carrying a long time. He came to me. He thought I would help him. The hearth fire was the only sound for a moment. The soft collapse of a log, the tick of cooling stone. What did you tell him? I told him to be careful. His voice was nearly inaudible. I told him the waters were dangerous. I was afraid. I had been afraid for 30 years, and I had practiced the fear until it was stronger than anything else. He finally set the hat on his knee and looked at her directly, with the deliberate effort of a man forcing himself to look at something he had been avoiding. 3 weeks after he came to me, his name appeared on a list of traitors. The edict was signed by the chancellor. There was no trial. The family's properties were seized. The house? I know what happened to the house. Her voice was flat, not cold. She was not performing coldness. It was simply that the words and the memory lived in the same room together, and she had learned to speak from that room without letting it speak for her. I was there. He closed his eyes. Henrik Dragici was not a traitor, he said. He was a scholar who found a document that Aldrich Moore needed to stay lost, and Moore needed it to stay lost because the seal exists, and the bloodline exists, and the legitimacy they confer together is legitimate. He stopped. Your father died because he understood the implications. The fire shifted. A log settled with a soft collapse of embers. Elowen had been holding the bronze ring since he began speaking. She became aware of this now. Her hand closed around it tightly enough to feel the engraving pressing into her palm. She did not open her hand. Henrik Dragici, she said. She said it slowly, putting the full name into the air between them. She had not said it aloud in 16 years, because saying it to someone who hadn't known him felt like handing a stranger something irreplaceable. Here now, with this man who had known him and failed him, the name carried a different weight. An accounting. A remarkable man, Emmerich said. His voice was careful, as if he understood what the name cost her. He translated 3 texts that no one else had managed. He had. A pause. Your hands, actually. The way he held a pen. She stood, crossed to the desk, came back with a document she had been drafting. I need you to sign this, she said. A notarized attestation of everything you've told me tonight, witnessed by the archive's official seal. The genealogy, what you found, when you found it, what Moore told you to do. He looked at the document, then at her. If I sign this. If you sign this, she said, it becomes evidence rather than a story. She held his gaze, and she did not make it easy. You've had 40 years to decide whether to be afraid. I'm giving you the chance to decide something else. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been a coward. The words came out with the specific flatness of something that had been examined too many times to carry any surprise anymore. I know, she said. She did not soften it. But I don't need your contrition. I need your signature. He picked up the pen. Roderick Vane found her in the library corridor at dawn, and she knew immediately from the particular set of his shoulders that he was delivering news he hadn't chosen to carry. He was a large man, built like someone who had grown up where the winters were long, and Mercy arrived late and left early. He had the kind of face that other men found reassuring. Steady, angular, capable, the face of a person who had decided a long time ago what he was for, and had not questioned it since. She had noted him as a person of consequence in her first week at the palace, and had been careful, in the 7 years since, to remain invisible to him. Something had changed that calculation without her choosing it. Lady Isolde Brennan filed a petition with the Imperial Council last night, he said. No preamble. She appreciated that. You've been classified as a willful intruder in an Imperial protected zone. The Council has 48 hours to render a decision. And if I don't respond? Expulsion from the capital. He paused. Or worse, depending on which members of the Council feel like making a point. She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the middle distance. The light was coming up, gray and thin, through the window at the end of the passage. She held the information the way she held a difficult translation, turning it, finding the seams. Lady Isolde isn't the villain here, she said. He seemed slightly surprised she'd said it. No, she's been engaged to the Emperor for 2 years on the strength of a political arrangement with the Northern Lords. If that arrangement dissolves, the border agreements dissolve with it. He paused again, with the quality of someone choosing their next words with real care. She doesn't know where the petition's evidence came from. Elowen looked at him. Moore gave it to her faction. Almost certainly. She doesn't know that. Almost certainly not. She pushed off the wall. I need access to the records archive, the section with the tax rolls, the pre-reform cadastral surveys, and the Mastercraft registry from the Imperial Foundry. He watched her. What are you building? Not a defense. She had been thinking about this since the library, since before the library, since the moment in the courtyard when the light had come from her own hand, and she had understood, not completely, but enough, what it meant. An indictment. She built it over 2 days in the restricted archive, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 7 years learning exactly where information lived and what form it took when it was trying to disappear. Emmerich's signed attestation was the cornerstone. The chronicle she had translated herself became its own evidence. She had held those pages, she knew that document the way she knew her own handwriting, and she documented this in careful, specific terms that left no room for dismissal. The genealogy, properly attested, traced her mother's line back through 4 generations to the founding empress's secondary household. Then the harder pieces. The dissolution order, signed by Aldrich Moore, countersigned by no one, not by the old emperor whose name it invoked, not by any judicial officer, not by a single council member. Just Moore's seal and the date, and below it, Henrik Dragici listed as a traitor, and below that, the address of a house that no longer existed. She spent an hour with it, reading it the way her father had taught her to read official documents, watching what it worked hardest to justify, listening for the silence where justification should have been. There was no trial record. She checked every archive, every register. A man had been condemned and his family destroyed, and there was no trial record anywhere in the Imperial Archive because there had been no trial. Just a document and a signature and the silence of people who had decided that silence was the safest choice. The craft registry was the last piece. She found it near the end of the second day, the Foundry's master records, listing commissions going back to the Empire's founding. The Imperial seals casting, and below it, in the same Foundry's hand, the record of a Dracaci family commission. A ring, bronze, eagle motif, and the small craftsman's mark that the Foundry pressed into every piece they made. A tiny chevron, cut into the metal below the main design. She had the ring. She turned it over. The chevron was there, almost invisible with age, but present. A small and stubborn fact, surviving in the bronze, because no one had known to remove it. She spread everything on the table and looked at it for a long moment. She had the sensation of a document finally making sense, all the parts visible at once, nothing hidden, nothing needing explanation. "This isn't a petition," she told Roderick when he came to check on her progress. "This is a record of murder." He looked at the documents, then at her. His expression did not change in any way she could have specified. But something behind it did, some small, careful rearrangement. "I'll get you in front of the council," he said. She noticed in those 2 days that he came by more than the task required. She had noted him as methodical and unsentimental, not the kind of man who made unnecessary visits. But twice she looked up from her work to find him pausing in the doorway, long enough to register that she was still there and the lamp was still burning before moving on. The third time, she mentioned it. "You've been noting my hours," she said without looking up. A brief pause. "The night watch routes past the section at the 4th hour. I've observed your lamp is typically still lit." "Since when?" "Since the first week you were here." He said it without inflection. "You're the only person in this wing who works past the 3rd hour consistently." She considered this. She filed it with the same precision she applied to everything else and returned to the dissolution order. It was a small thing, but she had learned that small things taken seriously were often the only honest currency available. The gray horse had a name she couldn't pronounce and a temperament like January weather, unpredictable, unimpressed by effort, capable of sudden warmth that felt like an accident, and was probably not. She had been sent to the stables for the annual asset inventory, which the head of the record office had described as standard procedure, and which turned out to mean standing in the presence of several large animals who had no interest in being accounted for. She was working methodically through the ledgers when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. He was standing at the stable entrance, alone, no guard, no announcement. He looked at her, then at the gray horse, then at the careful distance she was maintaining from both. Something in his expression, the almost invisible compression of his mouth, registered this with the economy of a man who had learned to take in information without advertising that he was taking it in. "You've never ridden," he said. Not a question. She didn't understand, for a moment, why that particular observation should carry anything other than information. Then she understood that he was asking to understand something, and that the thing he wanted to understand wasn't about horses. "The records don't require riding," she said. No. He entered the stable properly, moving past her to the gray horse with the ease of someone for whom large animals had never been foreign. The horse leaned toward him slightly. She noted this as data about both of them. "Come here." The first morning he stood 3 paces from her and talked her through standing next to the horse, as though explaining a tactical problem. His instructions were specific and unembellished. Left hand on the mane, not the neck. White evenly distributed, not on the heels. And she followed them with the same attention she gave to manuscript notation. The horse exhaled heavily through its nose. She flinched. "It won't hurt you," he said. "I know that." She steadied herself. "I am aware the flinch was involuntary." "I can see that." He could see everything, she realized. He was watching her with focused, undisclosed attention, the attention of someone learning something they had decided to keep to themselves. It was unnerving in a way she couldn't categorize, so she noted it and moved on. The morning ended with her having touched the horse 11 times without retreating. He said nothing except "same time tomorrow," and walked out of the stable yard, and she stood in the smell of hay and cold leather, and felt something she didn't have a name for yet. She filed it under pending. The second morning, he helped her mount. She had expected instruction. Instead, he came to stand beside her, close enough that she could see the particular texture of the dark wool at his shoulder, and put one hand lightly under her elbow to guide her step into the stirrup. The contact lasted, perhaps 3 seconds. She was sitting in the saddle before she had entirely processed the warmth of it, and by the time he had moved to a proper distance and was examining the stirrups with professional interest. She looked down at him from the height of the horse's back, a new geometry, a new angle. From here she could see the line of his jaw, the way the morning light fell across his cheekbone, and something about looking down rather than up made her aware of her own breathing in an entirely new and inconvenient way. She adjusted her posture and fixed her attention on the space between the horse's ears. "Sit forward slightly," he said. "Not a lean, just shift your weight." She shifted her weight. Better. She became very interested in the middle distance. The third morning the horse moved and she stayed on, a negotiated peace rather than a victory, and afterward, walking the circuit at a slow walk, she asked him, "Why are you teaching me?" He walked beside her, one hand occasionally touching the horse's flank to redirect. He didn't answer immediately. She had learned by the third morning that this was not avoidance. He was determining what, exactly, he was willing to say, and how much of the real thing he was willing to put into words. "I was crowned at 22, he said finally. "My father died without warning. There were things I was expected to know that no one had ever taught me, and I had to learn them at speed, in public, with consequences for every mistake." The horse's hooves were quiet on the frost-hardened ground. A bird landed on the foul wool and did not stay. "You remind me of that," he continued. "The particular discomfort of needing to learn something that everyone else assumes you already know." She considered this for a moment. She was aware of him walking beside her. The particular quality of his silence, which was dense rather than empty, occupied rather than vacant. She did not respond immediately, because some sentences close themselves if you answer too quickly. "He taught me to read by reading imperial edicts aloud," she said eventually. "My father, he said the language was the most honest form of dishonesty, that you could see exactly what a document was hiding by watching what it worked hardest to justify." He was quiet for a moment. "My father said something similar." His voice had shifted, a slight reduction of something that was already minimal. He said edicts were tools, that the same tool could do the right work or the wrong work depending entirely on who held it. "Did he tell you how to make sure you held it correctly?" The silence that followed was long enough to become a specific shape, the shape of something he didn't often allow himself to think about in the company of others. "He didn't have time," he said. She didn't fill the silence after that. They walked the rest of the circuit with the frost crunching softly underfoot, and the winter sun barely clearing the eastern wall, and she understood without needing to examine it further, that she had been told something real, something that had not been prepared in advance, and offered at calculated moments, but simply given because they were walking together, and the moment had asked for it. The fourth morning, fog lay so thick she could barely see the far wall of the yard. The world reduced to gray, to the sound of hooves on frozen earth, to breath made visible and then gone. She completed a full circuit at a trot without falling, and without gripping the saddle, which felt like something she hadn't known she needed to prove until she'd proved it. When she brought the horse to a stop before him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite pride, not quite relief. Something quieter than either. Something that had not arranged itself to be seen, and was therefore more legible than the things that had. "Tomorrow you go before the council," he said. "Yes." "Is there anything you need?" She looked at him. The honest answer was complicated. She needed a great many things. Most of them beginning with 16 years ago, and not resolvable in a stable yard on a foggy morning. The less honest answer was simple and true at the same time. No, she said. I have everything I need. He nodded. He turned to go, and she watched his shoulders, which she had come to understand as a more legible record of his inner state than his face. They were set, today, braced against something she couldn't see. He stopped. Elowen. The name. Not the archivist. Not Dragici. Her name in his voice, which was lower than she expected it to be in an unguarded moment. Lower and quieter, as though it had not been meant to travel far. She waited. Why 9? The council chamber smelled of old wood, and older ambitions, and every man in it was performing composure with varying degrees of success. Elowen stood at the presentation position, center of the floor, facing the 11-person table, and arranged her documents in order. She had been in this room 3 times before as a transcriptionist. She knew where the acoustics were bad, where the light hit the table wrong, which counselors sat with their backs to the windows, and therefore squinted at papers placed before them. She had noted all of it the same way she noted everything, 7 years ago, filed under useful someday. Someday had arrived. Lady Isolde Brennan sat at the petitioner's seat to the right, dressed in pale gray that managed somehow to be both perfectly appropriate and a reminder that she had been doing this kind of thing for longer than Elowen had been in the capital. She was beautiful in the way of a person who had always known they were beautiful, and had therefore been able to put it aside and develop other skills. She did not look at Elowen with hatred. She looked at her with a careful, neutral assessment of someone evaluating a threat, which was both worse and more honest. At the head of the table, the Emperor sat with a stillness that was not passive. It was the stillness of something held precisely in place. Freder Emmerich sat to the left at the witness position, hands folded on the table before him. He had come. She had not been certain he would come until she saw him, and seeing him, she felt something loosen in her chest. Small but specific, the release of a tension she had not acknowledged she was carrying. She began. She presented the chronicle translation first, the simplest foundation, the document that existed independently of everything she claimed. Her own work, her own handwriting, the original text available for comparison by any member of the council who wanted to look. Then the genealogy with Emmerich's attestation and his verbal confirmation when the council chair asked him to speak to its authenticity. She watched one of the northern councillors lean slightly forward as she placed the genealogy on the table, and she watched him lean back again when she moved on, and she noted both movements with the care she gave to anything that was trying not to be noticed. She had reached the foundry records, the ring, the chevron, the unbroken chain of physical evidence, when it happened. A councillor from the eastern province, a man she had noted as belonging to the chancellor's informal network, rose and placed a document on the table. It bore the seal of the old council, the one dissolved in the previous reign. The document claimed to show Dragici family correspondence with a conspiracy against the late emperor. The room became a different kind of quiet. She asked to see it. He hesitated, then passed it. She read it carefully. 2 minutes. Some of the councillors were watching her face. She kept it still. The signature at the bottom of the document was her father's name, written in a hand she had spent 7 years studying. She had translated his letters, noted his annotations, copied documents he had marked in margins for her attention. She knew the particular way he crossed his T's, almost horizontally, with a slight upward curve at the right end. She knew the leftward lean of his capital letters. She knew the way he signed his full name when he was being formal, which was different from the way he signed it when he was in a hurry, and different again from the way he signed it when he was tired. This was none of those ways. This signature is forged, she said. The word of one woman. The emperor stood up. He did not do it loudly. He did not do it with any particular drama or declaration. He simply rose from his chair, and the room became completely silent the way rooms became completely silent for very few people in the world. Not from fear alone, but from the recognition of a specific gravity, a weight that was not performed and could not be borrowed. "Give me both documents." She passed them. He read them with the unhurried thoroughness she had learned in the stable yard was characteristic of him. He did nothing at partial speed. When he finished, he set both documents on the table and looked at the counselor, who had produced the forged one, with an expression that was completely calm and completely specific. "This document carries the seal of the old council." His voice was conversational in volume. Every word arrived precisely where it was aimed. "The old council dissolved in 1183. This seal's date of issue is 1187. He looked around the table, slowly. 4 years after the institution that supposedly produced it ceased to exist. The silence in the room was total. 11 counselors, 1 petitioner, 1 witness, 1 emperor, and the documents on the table, which were telling only one story, which was that someone had made a very careful mistake and left it where a careful person would find it. "I want to know who manufactured this document," he said, "and I want to know who placed it in your hands." He looked at Lady Isolde. She met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had not known, and was now realizing, and was managing both the realization and the management of her expression simultaneously. Her hands on the table were perfectly still, but tightened, fractionally, at the edge of her documents. Then his eyes found Alowan's across the room. "Continue your presentation." 3 words. But the council understood, from those 3 words, everything they needed to understand. And the testimony that followed moved in a very different direction. The judgment came after 45 minutes of deliberation. Isolde's petition suspended, pending investigation. Dragici bloodline provisionally recognized. More summoned to produce the original dissolution order. She was gathering her documents when she felt, rather than saw, the moment Moore looked at her. She turned. He was sitting in the far corner of the chamber, where counselors of the second tier sat, during contested sessions, and his face was the careful non-expression of a man who had spent decades practicing exactly that faith. But his eyes went to her wrist, to the ring. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to be intentional, not long enough to be dramatic. She understood, with the specific clarity of a person who had been trained to read documents, that the session in this chamber was not the end of anything. It was the pause before a different kind of action. 3 weeks passed. They passed in the particular tension of a city waiting for something to resolve, the held breath quality of a place where the next thing has been decided, but not yet delivered. Moore was called before the emperor twice. The forged document was sent for independent analysis by the Guild of Illuminators, who confirmed within a week that the seal's date was impossible. Lady Isolde's faction became very quiet, which was either resignation or regrouping, and Alowan, who had spent her professional life understanding the difference between those 2 states in written evidence, was not certain which. She worked. She was not avoiding anything. Work had always been the thing she trusted, the thing that remained legible when everything else became noise. She began the formal documentation of the Dragici genealogy, which was the kind of careful, long, patient work she had always done best. She thought about it as she worked. She thought about her father reading edicts aloud in the lamplight, treating each word as though it carried both meaning and danger. She thought about the ring on her finger, the chevron barely visible in the bronze, and she worked. She was at the 11th hour when she heard running in the corridor. Roderick Vane opened her door without knocking, which had never happened in 7 years, and she understood before he said anything that something serious had occurred. His face was the same as always, that angular, deliberate steadiness, but his breathing was not. And in 7 years she had learned that the things Roderick didn't control were the things that mattered. "He's been hurt," he said. "An attack. 4 men, paid work, they got through the outer yard. He took a blade to the left side before we stopped them. The physicians are with the guardsmen. 3 of the night watch are in worse condition." He was already turning. "Your lamp was the only one showing. Come with me." The box of supplies he handed her in the corridor was a military kit. She knew what she was looking at. The Emperor's rooms were nothing like she had imagined, which was to say she had not imagined them, which was to say she had been careful not to. They were large and spare. A desk stacked with documents, a fire burning lower than it should, the smell of cold stone and lamp oil, the smell of a room where someone worked late and alone and had grown accustomed to both. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his right hand pressed to his left side, the battle tunic removed, the cloth of the undershirt dark with blood that was fresh enough to still be moving. He looked up when she entered. He did not say anything. Neither did she. She set the kit on the table by the bed and pulled a chair close, and began to work with the careful efficiency of someone who had decided to do the practical thing before she allowed herself to feel anything else. The wound was a clean cut, 15 centimeters, not deep enough to threaten anything vital but bleeding freely. She had dressed her own injuries enough times to work without hesitation, which was what the moment required. She tried not to register the warmth of skin she had never been this close to. "Tell me if this is too much," she said. "It isn't." His voice was different in this room, lower and stripped of something, the performing layer that she hadn't realized was there until it was absent. "Take your time." She cleaned the wound. He breathed slowly and evenly, the controlled breathing of a man who had trained himself to manage pain without showing it. When she pressed the cloth to stop the bleeding, she felt his abdominal muscles tighten, involuntary, the body's honest response, and looked up to check on him. He was looking at her. The distance between their faces was less than it had ever been. His eyes were dark gray in this light, smoke and iron, and there was something in them she didn't have a clean word for. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'll be quick." "Don't be." The words were quiet enough that she might have been meant to pretend she hadn't heard them. She chose to keep her eyes on her work. They talked while she bandaged him, not because they planned to, but because the silence in that room at that hour had weight, and talking was easier than sitting inside it without something to hold. She told him about her father the way she had never told anyone, not the official version, not the victim's version, but the real version, the one that lived in actual memories she trusted. The way Henryk Dragici had read documents to her as a child, treating each word as though it carried both meaning and danger. The way he had laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. The specific color of the lamplight in the room where he worked, and the smell of it, and the sound of his voice reading Latin in a tone that was half reverence and half argument with the author. Colin listened. Not the performative listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind that left a space in the room for what she was saying. "My father was the same way about edicts," he said when she paused. "He believed they were the most honest expression of what a ruler actually valued. Not the speeches, not the declarations, but the small practical orders, the ones that nobody thought to examine." "Did he tell you what to look for?" The pause that followed was shaped differently from ordinary pauses. It had density. "He didn't have time," he said. She had heard this before. In the stable yard a month ago, said in a different register. This time, it landed differently, and she understood that the two instances were connected. That he didn't have time was a sentence he had been living inside for 6 years, wearing it like something that had grown to fit and couldn't be removed without leaving a mark. She tied the last knot of the bandage. Her hand rested on the cloth for one moment before she drew it back. "Finished," she said. He didn't move immediately. He was looking at her hands, the ink stain on her right knuckle, and now something else, a rust-colored smear across the back of her left hand, where a drop of his blood had dried. He looked at it without expression. She watched him look. "Ilowen." "Yes." "Stay." It was not a command. It was not precisely a request either. It occupied a different category, a need articulated with the minimal language of someone who almost never articulated needs at all, who had not practiced the vocabulary for it, and was using it anyway because the hour and the pain and the room had made something possible that the day would not have. She looked at him. She looked at the room. The candles burned to their midpoint, the warm low light, the window where the winter dark pressed against the glass. She rose, crossed to the bookshelf by the wall, and found a fresh candle. She lit it from the stub of the old one and placed it on the table by the window. Then she took the book she had been carrying from the library, a habit she had maintained for years, always something to return to, and sat in the chair beside the bed. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She read. He slept, or something near it, the provisional, watchful rest of someone whose body had insisted. The night moved slowly through its middle hours, deep and very quiet. Occasionally, she heard his breathing change, quicken slightly, the way breathing changes in difficult sleep, and she looked up and watched until it steadied. Once he opened his eyes and found her still there, and closed them again, and she felt something in the room shift, a slow atmospheric change, the way a room changes when something that has been held at a distance is no longer held at a distance. When the first cold gray light came through the window, Roderick entered. He looked at her. He looked at Shalin. He said nothing, but one corner of his mouth moved, a fractional acknowledgement, so small it might not have been intentional, that she noted and filed away. She began to pack up her things. Eloin. She stilled. "Your hand." She looked down. The dried blood, his blood, was still on her left hand, rust dark against her skin. "It's fine," she said. "I know it is." He said it quietly. "I just wanted you to know I saw it." He took her wrist. She had not expected the contact, and then it was there, his hand, warm and deliberate, turning her wrist slightly to look at the mark. His thumb rested at her pulse point for one moment before he released her. She walked back to her room through empty corridors while the palace woke around her. She stopped once, in a long stretch of cold hallway, and stood still with no particular reason to stand there, aware only of the warmth that had not yet entirely left the place where his hand had been. 1 week later, the morning was pale and still, and the library smelled of wax and old paper, and Roderick was reading her the official summary of Moore's investigation with the same tone he might use to report weather conditions. "He's been suspended pending inquiry," Roderick said. "The dissolution order has been flagged for review. Formal charges for the forged document are being prepared." "And the attack?" "The hired men's chain leads back to Moore's private accounts. The investigation is expected to take 30 days. After that..." "My father won't come back," she said. She was looking at the window. The courtyard was visible through it, the black granite gate, the morning light moving across stone. "No. He didn't soften it. He never did. But his name will." He gathered his papers. Then near the door he stopped. "You stayed the whole night," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. She met his eyes briefly. Someone had to. He nodded once, with the air of a man who had received sufficient data, and left. She was deep in a passage of church Latin. 9th century, formal register, a land charter that had been misfiled in the natural history section for at least 100 years and had begun to develop the personality of something that had spent a century somewhere it didn't belong. When the door opened, she knew without looking up who it was. She had learned the particular sound of his arrival over the past weeks, the absence of unnecessary noise, the specific way the latch released when someone who knew the room opened it. She finished her sentence, set down her pen. He sat across from her. He had a sheaf of decrees that needed signing. For a while neither of them spoke. She returned to her translation. He worked through his documents. The fire made the only sound. It was strange, she thought. This was not nothing. This was something. What made it remarkable was precisely how unremarkable it felt. Two people in a room, each doing the work in front of them, and the room around that being entirely sufficient. She had not expected that. She had not known what to expect. "Stay," he said. He was not looking up from his decree. "I'm here," she said. "Not the library, Vera." She put her pen down. "You have a fiancé, Your Majesty." "The arrangement with Lady Isolde is political, if the bloodline is formally recognized." "I'm not talking about politics," she said. She interrupted him. She had never interrupted him. The awareness of it sat briefly in the air between them, acknowledged by both and remarked on by neither. "I'm asking what you mean," she said. "Not what the political structure supports, what you mean." He looked up. She met his gaze and held it. Outside, a bird crossed the window. A log settled in the hearth. "If I stay for political reasons," she said, "then I'll stay for political reasons, and that is exactly what we'll have. If you want something else, I need to hear you say it." The silence stretched. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and she thought that this was the real version of all the translations she had ever done. The moment when the formal language fell away, and the actual sentence became visible beneath it, and you either read it honestly, or you didn't. "I don't want you to stay because of the seal," he said finally, "or the bloodline, or because a political arrangement needs to be replaced with something of equivalent utility." He stopped. Started again. "Every morning I go to the stable yard." He held her gaze. "And when you're not there, I know it before I know anything else about the day." She sat with this for a moment. She let it occupy the space it needed to occupy. "I have conditions," she said. "I know you would." And there it was, the smallest possible softening at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile she had seen only twice before, which she was beginning to understand, was the full version of what other people performed as open delight. "My father. His name must go into the imperial record as a scholar and translator of Verith. Not because it benefits me, because it's true." "Done." "And you don't call me the archivist after today." "Done." "And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you tell me what you're actually thinking, not policy. The real things." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, the morning had turned fully bright. "Aldrich Moore reminds me of the men who surrounded my father," he said. His voice was quieter now. Quieter than policy, quieter than official language, the register he used only when there was no one left to perform for. "Men he trusted. And every morning when I sign the decrees, I think about the fact that I don't know how to make sure I'm not walking the same path. That I don't know what the indicator would look like from inside." He paused. "That's what I think about. I don't say to anyone." She listened. She did not interrupt, and she did not soften it, and she did not offer him a reassurance she hadn't earned yet. When he finished, she looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at a document she was finally allowing herself to understand, not just to process, and said, "That's exactly why you won't." A silence settled between them, warm rather than empty. "I'll stay," she said. The trial lasted 2 days. Aldrich Moore stood accused of forgery, misuse of imperial seal authority, unlawful dissolution of a noble house, suppression of imperial genealogical records, and commissioning an assassination against the emperor. He stood through it with the careful composure of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where composure was the only remaining resource, and spent it accordingly. The verdict when it came was unanimous. Eloan was in the library when Roderick told her. She was working on the Byzantine land charter, still misfiled in her mind, still somewhat bewildered to have found itself the subject of this much attention. And she was doing it with the same focused attention she had given every piece of work for 7 years. The work was the same. She was not quite the same. Guilty on all counts, Roderick said. Stripped of his position. The dissolution order formally annulled. Your family's properties. He paused. What remains of them are restored in name to the Dragici family, effective immediately. She set down her pen. The properties are gone, she said. The house is gone. Yes. He didn't dress it, but the name is clean. She looked at the translation in front of her for a moment. She touched the ring on her finger, not conscious of it, not nervous. Just a small gesture of contact with something she had been carrying for a long time. The way you touch the wall of a room when you've lived in it long enough to know it by feel. Your father would be proud, Roderick said. She didn't answer. The pad of her thumb pressed the engraved eagle, gently, once. Then Roderick did something she hadn't expected. He set his papers on the corner of her desk and looked out the window at the courtyard below. The black gate, the morning light moving across granite, and was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that was not impatience or calculation, but simply a person giving weight to something. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than his usual register. I've watched you work in this wing for 7 years, he said. I've never known anyone who held that much still. It was, she understood, the closest thing to well done that he was built to offer. She received it the way it was given. Thank you, Roderick, she said. He picked up his papers and left, and the room was quiet again, and outside the courtyard seal burned in its steady amber way, as though it had never considered doing anything else. Spring came to Verith on a morning when the courtyard stones finally held warmth again. Every morning, she walked through the inner courtyard, and every morning the seal in the black granite gate burned softly amber as she passed. She had stopped flinching at it weeks ago. Now she simply acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged the quality of the morning light, or the sound of the fountain that had finally been unfrozen after the last hard freeze. As something present, and particular and hers, in the quiet way that things become yours without ceremony, because you have been present with them long enough to have earned a kind of mutual recognition. Frater Emmerich found her on a Tuesday afternoon in the library garden, where she had taken a manuscript to read in the unfamiliar warmth. He was older looking than when she had first seen him, standing in the doorway of her room in his wet habit, 40 years of a secret pressing his shoulders down. The winter had taken something from him that spring had not returned. Can you forgive me? He asked. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed too many times, not expecting the words to do the work anymore, expecting only to have finally said them, to have survived saying them. She thought about it, truly thought about it, in the way she thought about difficult documents, without hurry, without charity beyond what the evidence supported. My father died because one person didn't have the courage to speak, she said. I can't tell you that means nothing. It means something that I will carry. She looked at him. But you spoke when it mattered. Late, but you spoke. That isn't forgiveness. No, she agreed. But it's the truth. And I work better with truth than with forgiveness. He sat with this for a moment, the specific silence of a man receiving exactly what he had actually earned rather than what he had hoped for. Then he nodded, with a dignity she had not expected, and rose. She watched him walk away through the courtyard, and the sun was warm on the backs of her hands, and she returned to her manuscript. Lady Isolde Brennan left Vareth on a morning with good traveling weather, clear, cool, the kind of day that made distances feel achievable, rather than punishing. The political arrangement had been dissolved carefully, with the northern lords receiving trade concessions that more than compensated for the broken match. Isolde had negotiated those concessions herself, which Eloin considered a significant demonstration of competence. The kind of competence that reorganized itself around new circumstances and made those circumstances work. Isolde stopped in the library hall on her way through the palace. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Eloin at her desk in the morning light. The ink-stained hands, the neat stacks of documents, the small bronze ring. "You're better than I expected," Isolde said. Eloin looked up. "So are you." Something passed between them, not warmth, exactly, but a mutual recognition. Both of them had been in their different ways doing the only things available to them. Both had done those things with real skill. That was not nothing. Isolde inclined her head once, and was gone. Eloin watched the empty doorway for a moment. Then she turned back to the page. The mornings had changed. He came to the library now without occasion. The way he came to his own study, or to the council chambers, or to the stable yard at dawn. He arrived. He brought his work. Sometimes they sat in complete silence for an hour, each occupied with separate documents, and it was the comfortable silence of people who had stopped performing ease at each other and had arrived at the real thing. On a morning in late spring, she arrived to find him already there, reading something that turned out to be her translation of the Byzantine land charter, which she had left on the table the evening before. He was 2/3 of the way through it, reading it with the same attention he gave his own decrees, the kind of reading that expected to find something real. He finished the page. Set it down. "Your Latin is better than Emmerich's." "Emmerich will be devastated to hear that." "I won't tell him." He picked up the next page. "There's an error on page 4. "I know. The original text is incorrect. I annotated it at the bottom." He turned back. Found the annotation. Read it. A small sound escaped him, not quite a laugh, but the thing that lived in the same room as a laugh, the sound that happened when something pleased him more than he had expected. She had heard it twice before, in the stable yard when the gray horse sneezed directly into her face on the second morning, and once when she had described the water rights dispute of Pen 43 as the most passionately argued 11 pages ever written about a ditch. "You're right," he said. "I usually am, about errors." She uncapped her ink. "It's everything else I'm less certain about." He looked at her over the page. She kept her attention on the charter. They worked in silence for another hour. When he rose to leave, he gathered his decrees without ceremony, and at the door he paused. The pause she had learned to recognize as the pause that preceded a decision to say something rather than not. "The courtyard seal," he said. "It activated at my great-grandfather's coronation, and before that, when he was recognized by his mother as her heir. The chronicle mentions it occurs at moments of..." He considered the word. "Recognition, not power, not ceremony, recognition." She set down her pen. "I've read that chronicle," she said. "I know." His eyes held hers for a moment. Dark gray in the spring light. Smoke cleared to something steadier, something that had decided to be visible. I wanted to say it out loud. He left. She sat with the warmth of something that had been handed to her carefully and left in her hands. Eventually, she picked up her pen. The work was the same as it always was. She was not quite the same, and the room was not quite the same, and both of these things were true simultaneously, and she found, with some surprise, that she could carry them both without difficulty. She had started keeping a record of what she noticed about him. Not written down. She was too careful for that, too aware of what written things became once they existed outside the mind that made them. But she carried it anyway, the way you carry things that accumulate before you decide to, before you notice that you have been deciding. That he held a pen left-handed, but wrote with his right, the left hand always resting near the page, as though keeping something anchored. That when he was reading something that concerned him, a faint crease appeared between his brows that vanished the moment he looked up. Controlled so thoroughly she had only caught it twice, and only because she had been watching the document he was reading, and caught the crease in her peripheral vision. That in the stable yard on cold mornings he stood with his back to the wind on her side without appearing to have made a choice about it. That he asked questions very rarely, and when he did, the question was always the real one. Not the approach to the real one, not the preliminary warming up, but the thing itself, because he had decided it was worth the risk, and stopped wasting time on the preamble. She had noted all of it in the way she noted things, precise, methodical, the method she applied to documents and manuscripts, and the faint impressions that time left in old ink. She had filed it without labeling it, the way you file something when you're not ready yet to decide what it is. She was ready now. Outside in the courtyard, the April light moved across the black granite of the seal, in long, unhurried strokes. The amber glow was quiet and steady, with the quality of a fire that has been burning long enough to know its own rhythm, not performing anything, not announcing itself, simply present and warm and doing precisely what it had always been there to do. In the library, a pen moved steadily across vellum, 2 voices, low and unhurried, speaking in the rhythm of people who have stopped counting how long they have been talking, because the number has become irrelevant. A ring on a small finger, the engraved eagle catching the light as a hand turned a page. A window open to the morning, the sound of the courtyard fountain, the distant noise of a city going about its ordinary life. And 2 people working side by side in the particular quiet of those who have stopped needing to prove anything, to each other or to themselves or to the room, and have arrived, simply and without ceremony, at something that is precisely what it is. All of it exactly as it should be. The Verith Empire, 12th century. If Eloan's story stayed with you even a little, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit different for you. Was it the seal? The stable yard? The conditions she gave him? Your comments are genuinely what keeps this channel alive. So like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. It means more than you know.